Good afternoon, even morning possibly, everyone, and many thanks for accepting our invitation. My name is Ettore Greco. I am the Executive Vice President of the International Affairs Institute here in Rome, and also the head of his program on multilateralism and global governance. I'm very pleased to open this meeting, which is part of a project entitled a Transatlantic Bridge for Technological Cooperation, Challenges and Opportunities. We started this project in September last year. First of all, I wish to underline that the project is funded by the Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo of Turin, which is one of our most important strategic partners, thanks to a new research fund established by the Compagnia with what I think is a far-sighted and also widely appreciated decision to support and promote scientific research and debate on the most relevant technological challenges and their interplay with geopolitical transformation, the rapidly changing international environment. I think as our institute is indeed dedicating an increasing amount of work to technological issues, there is, I think, a growing ground for enlarging our partnership with the Compagnia also to technological topics. So the objective of this project, Transatlantic Bridge for Technological Cooperation, is essentially, in a nutshell, to examine the ongoing initiative and initiatives that can be undertaken in the future to strengthen and deepen the transatlantic dialogue and cooperation that can be helpful to address the global challenges stemming from technological innovation, with particular regard to two key sectors, the digital sector and energy transition. More specifically, we are examining, first of all, how to promote a common transatlantic assessment of the risks and opportunity associated with technological transformation in view of reducing the persistent transatlantic disputes and tensions in the trade and commercial field. Second, and closely related objective, what can be done to undertake a common transatlantic initiative vis-à-vis the main competitors and rivals on the international scene, notably China. The prospect has therefore a clear geopolitical dimension. This was one of the main features also of the call launched by the Compagnia, but it includes an overall assessment of the state of play of the transatlantic cooperation and its possible developments, but also a study of three specific sectors that our research team has identified at the beginning when we decided to prepare this project as being crucial for defining the strategic priorities of the US and the EU. Digital infrastructure and semiconductors for the digital part of the project, and hydrogen for the part related to energy transition. For these three different sectors, we have examined the degree of divergence or convergence between the European and US policies and strategies, and the limits and potentialities of the ongoing transatlantic initiatives. Those initiatives essentially aimed at deepening dialogue and cooperation across the Atlantic. And of course, we have paid special attention to the Trade Technology Council, which is perhaps the most important available instruments for the transatlantic dialogue, also diplomatic dialogue on trade and technology. And I want to underline that we at the EI have been studying quite closely the role of the TTC, being a member of a consortium called Trade and Technology Dialogue that the European Commission has entrusted with the task of providing research-based recommendations and proposals to the TTC. Today's meeting is dedicated to two digital issues, namely digital infrastructure and semiconductors. And 4 papers will be briefly presented and discussed from both European and US perspective. There will be then, within the framework of this project, a second meeting in Turin, where we will discuss the hydrogen issue on the basis of other 2 research papers. So we will, at the end of this project, have published a total of 6 research studies, plus a final report, and there will be also dedicated podcasts to illustrate the main results of our research. There will be, therefore, plenty of opportunities for you also to follow the developments of our research and to see what the research will produce over time. Let me stress that we are doing all this in close cooperation with leading research institutes from both sides of the Atlantic, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, with which our institute has a long-lasting history of extremely useful, fruitful cooperation. The GMF, within the framework of this project, has focused in particular on US interests, policies and strategies, as well as, of course, discussing the prospect of cooperation at transatlantic level in the sectors that I have mentioned. And second, the Centers for European Policy Network, which is a well-known study center which deals in particular with EU policies, including the regulatory aspects regarding the new technologies. We have also partnered with the Politecnico at the University of Turin. In cooperation with them, we will organize the meeting on the nexus between the new technologies and energy transition. So we have a rich menu already today, and then in next week. Let me again thank you for joining us for this meeting. I very much look forward to our discussion. And now, without further ado, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Nicolò Russo Perez, Head of International Relations at the Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo. Please, Nicolò, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Ettore. I hope you can hear me well.
We hear you.
Perfect. So thanks and welcome to all the participants. I'm very glad to be part of this event today. Sorry for not being in person in Rome, but I benefit from, let's say, the digital infrastructure that is also a topic that we will address during the conference. The Compagnia San Paolo, as you might know, is one of the largest independent foundation and also one of the few foundation in Italy with a quite relevant also focus on international activities. We do 3 typology of activities. One is policy-oriented research, so we try to support activities that can better inform the policymakers. Second, we support training and educational programs. And third, we support communication and outreach activities because we are convinced that it is very important to have a more informed public debate on the key challenges that we are facing at the international level. In terms of topic, we focus on the European dimension, on the transatlantic bond, and of course also on the Mediterranean dimension. As it was already said by Ettore, this project on a digital transatlantic bridge, economic security and cooperation is part of a new call for application that the Compagnia has launched last year, called Geopolitics and Technology. I'm very happy to see so today some of the results of one of the selected projects. We were able to support 11 different networks, and congratulations to the YAI, who was selected among one of those. The idea was precisely to support Italian think tanks, because those are the beneficiary of the call for application, also in partnership with academia and representative from the private sector, and stimulate the Italian think tanks landscape and community to reflect on the so-called non-kinetic challenges, so on the interconnection between the technological developments and their geopolitical impacts. So we were able to cover topics such as cybersecurity, energy security, but also protection of critical infrastructures, application of golden power for the protection of key assets for the national economy, and also further topics that we would like to address include cognitive warfare and foreign malign interferences in electoral processes, for instance. We will be able to launch a new call for application in the second part of the current year, and look very much forward to further informing you about this opportunity. So I would like to stop here. I thank, of course, the organizer, first of all, the representative from the Istituto Affari Internazionali, Ambassador Ferdinando Nelli Feroci, the chairman, but also Ettore Greco, the executive vice president, Fabrizio Botti, and Federica Marconi. And also I thanks the partner, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which is also a long-standing partner of the Compagnia di San Paolo, and the Center for European Policy Network for their contribution. So thanks a lot, and I wish you all a fruitful meeting and conversation. Thanks.
Many thanks, Nicolò. And now I'm glad to give the floor to Daniel Gross, Director of the Institute for European Policy Making at the Bocconi University. Let me stress that this is just a continuation of think of a dialogue which we are conducting on those issues, in particularly, I would say, the impact of US policies on Europe. We held a meeting specifically devoted to this issue some weeks ago. It was very interesting to hear his comments, and then also these introductory remarks, I think, will be the best way to set the stage for our debate. Please. Daniel.
Thank you very much. I will look at the issues from an economic point of view, and then leave some of the geostrategic conclusions to others, and there are some nice papers that will be presented later today. So, as had already said, transatlantic now means basically something trilateral, with China being the one that really we are thinking about all the time. So I wanted to go, if I manage, to go through 4 issues. The first one very quickly, and then perhaps more time on the last 2, and especially the focus on chips. So let me just start with a longer-term track record. I think this is useful to have as in the back of your minds, because there's this narrative that Europe is falling behind in industry, that we must do something to strengthen European industry, and that the US is doing much more. And therefore, I'm showing you here just the value of the output of not industry, but manufacturing over a longer time period of the US and the EU. And you see, basically, they are very parallel. There's a slight divergence when the euro is very strong, but basically they start and finish in the same relative position. About exactly equal over 20 years. I think that's quite remarkable. You see also poor Japanese, they were very similar in size to us, and now they have basically disappeared. And then you see China, which has really skyrocketed a factor of 10 in 10 to 15 years. And you see that just China is equal to US and Europe together. So across industry manufacturing, there's no way that you can have China not being the dominant producer in many, if not most, industries. Right? So the illusion that we somehow can overtake them is just not there. The productive potential is now in China. So I think that is very useful to keep in mind. And now, of course, as we said, as you can see here, we are now 15% of the world, so 1/6, and we were 1/3. That makes a difference. So we should, I think, calibrate our ambitions correspondingly. In terms of trade, I think the picture is rather different. You see here, of course, again, the share of China, which has exploded, red, but you see that the share of the EU in global manufacturing exports has actually remained not exactly constant, but it has really fallen very little. So in that sense, China has taken their export shares from the US, Japan, and some others, but European industry has actually fared not too badly. I think keep that in mind, as I said, in general, when we talk about chips as a special case. So let me, as I said, I wanted to be very quick on that one. The IRA was already a theme a couple of weeks ago here. So I will be extremely quick, but I wanted to bring out one general issue, which I think will matter in transatlantic relations. And basically, what the IRA does and some other things in the US can do is they can create a market that is protected from Chinese competition. Yep. And this is the way I think I showed already last time. So here in particular, this is for electrical vehicles, but there might be other areas as well. You have basically a barrier between the US and the US shields itself from Chinese exports. And that means there will be more trade, both exports and imports, between the EU and China. And of course, our producers have the US market for them. And on net, that is a big advantage. Any model you take, if two countries just have a trade war between themselves, the third one will benefit. So we should welcome the intention of Trump to have 60% tariffs towards China and 10% towards us. I think we would greatly benefit. Okay, that was a very quick run through the IRA and the basic intuition behind it. And now let me come to what I see as emerging trends in specialization, not emerging, ongoing trends, which you will see in particular in the chip sector. And that is, now I have to be very, very broad. This is basically that the US economy is specializing at two ends of the technology scale. On the one hand, they're producers of raw materials, soybeans, oil, gas. And by the way, that is one of the reasons why also you have the malaise of the manufacturing sector in the US. It gets squeezed from both sides. And then you have China, and perhaps I should have added other Asian countries that are capital intensive, and they, and especially China, are specialized in goods where you have both economies of scale and high capital intensity. In China, with the added proviso that the party chooses which sectors, but you see it also with other Asian countries that have a similarly high capital ratio. And then finally, you have the EU, which is increasingly specializing in areas that are not subject to economies of scale, so machinery, and which have, let's say, a low to medium capital intensity, because our supply of capital in terms of our national saving rates It's higher than the US, but lower than in China. And I wanted to illustrate that with a few numbers, which I think one has to keep in mind. China has really extraordinarily high savings rates, even by Asian standards, over 40% of GDP. And by the way, they are now in an area where they have already built everything they needed. So the question is, what do you do? I think this is one key factor that one needs to keep in mind when one looks at China and Asia in general. I don't show here the numbers for most other Asian countries, but let's say Japan, Taiwan, Korea, they are closer to China than to Europe in terms of savings rates. As I said, savings rates of, I don't know whether it works, 40% of GDP, the red line, that's extraordinary. Moreover, extraordinary sense of having persisted for such a long time and seeing no sign of it coming down. Within Europe, you see actually also some divergence between Italy and Germany. Germany has a much higher savings rate as Italy, for example. Italy is very close to the United States. So in terms of savings, you have the average of the euro area above the US, then some Asian countries, and then on top China. And of course, when you have all these savings, they remain bottled up to a large extent at home. And therefore, the capital-intensive industries migrate automatically into these areas. Let me just jump over this here. And now come to my focus on chips. As I said earlier, the chip sector really exemplifies the pattern which I mentioned earlier. But before coming to that, I wanted to plea for one recognition of the reality. The chip sector is not increasing in economic importance. Sales of chips relative to GDP are extremely small, less than 0.5%. And this percentage has not increased for 20 years. I don't want to line because it's boring, it's just horizontal. For the EU, the share of chips imports as a share of overall imports has halved. It was over 3% 20 years ago. It is now 1.6%. So, but this is really very important. In terms of the economic importance, you can look at the numbers, you can check them. It is not that chips are a sector which somehow, from its economic importance, right, directly, can create growth or transform your economy.
Can I say also that the costs have also decreased somewhat?
Of course, the costs have
So in this sense, the
share
reflects also this fact.
Yeah, of course, right. You have billions more transistors, as you all know, with Moore's law. But if you want to make money and build an industry and create jobs, this is not where you go. If you are Taiwan with 30 million, you can do it, but not for the EU with 450 million, right? So just keep it in mind, that's extremely important. This next fact about chip sector is the by far biggest importer of chips is China. Imports of chips by China are 10 times ours of the United States. And that has one simple corollary. We in the West, US, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, the EU, the UK, whatever, right? Everybody now subsidizes chip production. Okay? That will reduce the price of chip. And what country will gain most? China. Right? So, but keep that really in mind. It's just not, everybody says, oh, we have to do chips, you have to repatriate, you have to create fabs and so on. Very nice. But the end effect of this subsidy raise will be that there will be more chips than there would otherwise be. And the biggest importer is the one that will benefit most.
If I ask a question. So some say on the contrary, that in fact China is of course producing chips at much lower costs than the US. That's the what, for instance, the economist has been saying. In this sense, we are benefiting from those lower costs.
Well, there's a difference between chips and solar panels. Solar panels, as you said, right? Economies of scale, highly capital intensive, right? Chips are very different because every chip's different, and there's very highly specific technology. If you don't have, you can put as much capital as you want, right? There's a big difference. Chinese exports some chips, but it has a comparative disadvantage. It exports 1/3 of the chips it imports in value. Of course, it exports many chips and smartphones, right? That's another thing. But the first economy to suffer from a global chips war would be China. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. Now, as I promised earlier, what is the specialization pattern? I think also the papers that we have here can confirm that. Basically, the US specializes in the design software. Asia, not China, but Asia dominates the capital-intensive part. Fabs in Taiwan, in Korea, and so on. And as I said, the key reason is because these countries have a much higher capital intensity. And that's why the American fabs closed after a while and went over. And Europe, as I said earlier, machinery, ASML is the best example. And I think that's exactly the kind of niche where Europe can hold its own. And the big question for the policymakers is, should they try to change that, right? And if yes, in what direction? Should we try to subsidize capital-intensive fabs in Europe? Perhaps it will depend on further specialized inputs, right? Is that the best use of our money, or could we use the money to do some research and development, or even more specialized machinery? I think these are the questions that European policymakers should try. And if the US wants to continue subsidizing fabs in the US, they should be our guests. We can only benefit from that. So this is as I said, the global trade pattern in chips, which I think the colleagues already have in mind. Basically, the US provides the software, and the machinery go to Taiwan and Korea. They take the software and they export to China. Right, so they're at the very end of the feeding chain, so to speak. For once, I don't know for how long, because as I say here, China has tried very hard for a very long time to break into that business. With enough money, they might succeed, but I think this is an area where you need very specialized technological know-how, and that's very difficult just to copy or acquire or transfer. The EU, by the way, if you look at the history of the EU attempts to become a power in chips and digital technologies, you can have examples of any kind and number over the last 25 years. All of them were very successful in official publications, and you see the results today, right? This is just an area where I think you can waste a lot of money, especially if you go after the very capital-intensive part of the fabs. I have not spoken specifically about transatlantic cooperation, but you can imagine what kind of conclusion I'm coming to, which is let's do what is sensible for us, and actually would strengthen, I think, the transatlantic, not collaboration, but the complementarities. If we strengthen our position in machinery, they are in software, and the two together, we have already 3 of the legs, and the third one is mostly in like-minded nations in Asia, so I don't really see a big security risk there. Thank you very much.
Welcome to session 1 on chips. So it's hard to me to add something on what you just said, Professor Gross, on the relevance of the sector of chips, of semiconductors, or better, as semiconductors as a sector, as a product, or even better, as a global value chain with all the contradictions in terms of dependency or the role of public support that you were raising. But I'll leave this to our speakers. So this session is going to be the opportunity for the presentation of the 2 papers on chips and semiconductors made by 2 authors that are also our speakers today. The 2 papers are part of the project building our Transatlantic Technology Bridge, and they illustrates the US and the EU perspective on the semiconductors case study. So we have a very dense and tight program for this event. So let me introduce us by Julia Treu, Program Manager and Fellow with the Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome, Julia. And we also have the other order of papers, Nicola Bilotta, coordinator of the EU Supervisory Digital Finance Academy and Research Associate at the Florence School of Banking and Finance at the EUI. Nicola is also Associate Fellow at the EI. He's also joining the panel with the role discussant, Sanne van der Lutte, an independent China researcher and strategic thinker. Sanne was until recently senior policy advisor for the board members of the Dutch House of Representatives, and before this position, she was researcher at Klingendijk Institute and Leiden Asia Center. I think we should start from Julia. I leave the mic to you for the presentation of the paper titled Transatlantic Cooperation on Semiconductors at EU Perspective. Over to you, Julia. Thanks.
Thank you. So I will actually be giving the US perspective.
US.
As you can tell from my accent, I'm the American in the room today. So I will be giving US perspective on semiconductor policy. And I'm going to start with a quote from Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo, who said, "Semiconductors are like the water of the new economy. You can't do anything without them." So even as Professor Gross pointed out, they're not the biggest part of the economy, but everyone is talking about them. Everyone wants to invest in them. So they're important. And even though the industry is very cyclical, demand is still projected to grow for chips over the next few years. And the US has a dominant position in the industry, particularly design and software. But of the 10 largest semiconductor firms, 6 of them are American, about half of global sales as of 2022. But the US share of global manufacturing capacity has fallen over the past several decades. The most common figures that are cited on this are 37% in the 90s down to 12% today. And there's a very interesting debate about how these numbers are actually calculated. But what's important is that these are the figures that caught policymaker attention and sort of were widely cited by industry and government, saying we need to invest in this industry. And also the supply chain disruptions during the pandemic sort of raised awareness of the type of disruption that can occur when supply chains are no longer seamless. Again, the disruptions of 2020, 2021 were not necessarily illustrative of broader weaknesses within the semiconductor supply chain, and production of chips actually increased over that period, but it's sort of uniquely tied to the auto industry, who reduced their demand for chips as demand was projected to decline with the pandemic, and production then shifted to the most in-demand sectors as everyone was ordering computers for teleworking. And this just-in-time model within the auto industry sort of accounts for the largest disruptions in that time. But nevertheless, the United States has responded with new subsidy and investment plans around three main goals. The first of which is strengthening domestic industry and manufacturing. The second is combating China, and the third is de-risking supply chains. And on the first one, strengthening domestic industry, the major policies are the IRA, which is a climate bill by another name, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the infrastructure bill, and these have been dubbed Bidenomics. So the CHIPS Act gives about $52 billion to the semiconductor sector for manufacturing and for R&D. The first funding announcements came just last December, and we're focused on more military use chips. The second award was announced in January for a larger range, and the first over $1 billion award was announced just last week, again for legacy chips. So the semiconductor industry is very, very capital intensive. It requires enormous amounts of investment and R&D. So I think we should also contextualize the CHIPS Act figure within this context, and 52 billion sounds like a lot, but it's not actually that much compared to investments by countries, especially in East Asia, or in terms of the capital expenditures by the firms themselves. So it sort of calls into question a little bit whether these available resources will be enough to meet the stated ambitions. And Secretary Raimondo even hinted last week, the week before, oh, there might have to be a CHIPS Act too. So we'll stay tuned on that. But most of the focus has really been about the US domestic semiconductor industry and domestic measures rather than international cooperation. And I want to point out two challenges, potential challenges for the CHIPS Act. The first is workforce. If you look to Taiwan, careers in semiconductors are very highly desirable and highly prestigious. And for this to be the case in the US, certain culture change needs to happen in addition to the workforce training that needs to be built up to supply these new fabs. If you look at the guidance around the CHIPS Act subsidies, for example, that were released with the bill, firms have to meet childcare requirements, which is to help women get into manufacturing jobs, and it's sort of an illustration of the larger social vision that's being pursued through the Bidenomics strategy writ large. And there's also the question, as Professor Gross sort of hinted to, about whether the chips industry is actually the one that creates the good middle-class jobs that the policy claims to want. So it's sort of an open question again. A second potential challenge is balancing across the whole value chain from fabrication to packaging. ATP is very important, and most of it is concentrated in Southeast Asia. And we want to make sure that all these fabulous new chips that will be built in, will be made in Arizona, don't have to be shipped back to Taiwan for packaging. The second very important goal is combating China. This is the important thing for the US, and the national security and geopolitical rivalry part really can't be underestimated when it comes to the chip strategy. 92% of sub-10 nanometer chips are made in Taiwan, mostly by TSMC. And this concentration has really unsettled policymakers, and they're very concerned about potential conflict. And this really explains the desire to reshore chip manufacturing. Some US policymakers have called for very extreme measures to say, we should blow up TSMC if China invades, and others say, no, even if China took control of Taiwan, they don't have the expertise to actually run these fabs. But the concern about conflict with Taiwan is more of a medium-term concern, and this means that the primary interest in chips is about providing for and securing the defense industrial base in the US in order to be prepared and self-sufficient if the conflict arises. Another important piece of the combating China goal is the export controls that the US has put in place on the chip industry. A very significant ruling was made in October 2022 on exports of advanced chips, specifically for AI, with new licensing requirements and restrictions on US persons working in the chip industry in China. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan calls the policy small yard, high fence. Additional restrictions were tightened last October, and negotiations are ongoing with obviously the Netherlands, home to ASML, Germany, and South Korea. And aligning these export controls is a source of tension. The US is also concerned that China's subsidies will lead to a situation for current and mature chips, the 28 nanometer chips, as occurred with solar panels 10 years ago. namely a flood of cheaper imports that would undercut domestic industry. I'm sure we can have some debate about that, as it was sort of hinted in the presentation, but that is a real concern right now among US policymakers. And the third goal, which is de-risking supply chains, is sort of tied to the above two, and it's about resiliency and resisting shocks. Pointing out two quick issues with this are that mapping supply chains in chips is very, very difficult. Intel, for example, has over 16,000 individual suppliers. ASML's EUV machines have over 800 suppliers globally. So you can imagine that mapping these supply chains is not an easy task, but redundancy is a part of ensuring resiliency. So even though fully mapping suppliers might be difficult, cooperation is needed to sort of identify the key bottlenecks. And when we're talking about cooperation, most of the EU-US cooperation has occurred through the TTC, although it's important to really emphasize that the EU and US chip industries are already very, very interconnected and intertwined, whether it's through investment, research and development. Even though each region has its specific strengths, they are already very closely linked. But a couple major challenges there will be defining metrics of success of these new chip policies. What does success look like in 5 or 10 or 15 years? What kind of chips should the US be producing? In what quantities for what sectors? I don't think we necessarily have the answers to this yet. And the metrics question also applies to the foreign policy and export control measures as well, and the possibility of a subsidy race. So in the paper, we talk about some recommendations, but maybe we can turn to those after Nico presents his paper as well, and we can get back to new avenues for the EU and US.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot, Julia, for your comprehensive review and analysis of the US approach to the sector. So from the US perspective to the EU's ambition in a transatlantic technology bridge, I'm quoting your title, Nicola. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. I mean, from my accent, you can understand that I'm going to present the European side, right? First of all, it's very nice to be here with old and new friends to discuss about this super hot topic. And I'm going to focus my presentation on questions. So my first question is about the European Chips Act. So I think Daniel Groth's presentation was already mentioning a few key points. And the key point is that the COVID and the chip shortage shows the dependency of the European Union industry towards external providers, foreign external providers. If you see through the whole supply chain of chips, 80% of suppliers to UA companies in the semiconductor industries are located outside the European Union. So there is the economic side and there is the strategic side. So the European Chip Act is claiming to provide incredible funding for the European industry to finally, gain some sort of independency or reducing independence in key nodes within the supply chain. My first question is, it is true? If you compare, as Julia was mentioning, the funding that other countries such as China, South Korea, Taiwan are inputting to subsidize the chips industry, the European Union money seems nuts. And as some colleagues recently told me, they're having some headache to actually try to understand how much money the European Union is actually putting for the chips production. So, part of the funding is coming from the Next Generation EU, some part of the funding is coming from the European Chip Act, and some other funding is some private investments that we can imagine. So, first of all, as a bit of clarity, how much money the European Union is actually inputting, and is connected to the second critical question: for what? As was mentioned, the supply chain of semiconductor is highly fragmented, highly specialized. So the European Union should target strategically where? Should the European Union invest where it's strong? So in machinery. Should we try to reduce our dependency where we are weak? So in the packaging. Where? We have little money, so strategically thinking, okay, so what do you do with the little money we have? Third question, internal competition. As we know, COVID is apparently over, so the relaxation of fiscal rules is also getting over. So we might face an issue where we have countries with higher, let's say, space for public investments that they can fund and co-fund private investments. So we could also see an asymmetry in terms of allocation of European funds. Going to the complicated interaction between the European Union and the United States. So the two industries, the supply chain of chips between the European Union and the US is highly integrated, as we know. Was news like a few weeks ago, I think, that Intel released, like the news that it was investing to open a new fab in Germany, an investment of 30 billion, if I recall correctly, out of which 9.9 billion were allocated by the German government. 9.9 billion, so quite a solid investments, right? So my second question is related to the transatlantic relation. Is if we look at the TTC, and as YAI, we had a very unique window of opportunity because we were working at the TTD, and we saw not the institutional dialogue going slow, but even the, let's say, research side going slow, because there are very different paradigms of development when we look at what the European Union is trying to promote in terms of technological model of development and the US one. If you see the TTC, for example, on chips, it's much easier for the European Union and the US try to find common ground in export control. And here again, another layer of complexity. We know, for example, that ASLM is, a critical node in the supply chain because it's producing a unique piece that is needed, and is a company based in the Netherlands. Well, the US government went directly and bilaterally negotiate with the Netherlands to implement some restriction on the latest chip and the latest piece that ASLM was producing, without going to the European Union. And clearly there was a reaction from the German government, from the European institution, mentioning this should be a European approach. So again, the European Union is lacking a common approach when we talk about export control. Of course, it's an effort that is going on, and the European Union is also improving, qualitatively speaking, is export control scheme. My final point is no one can make it alone. What I mean, this chips supply chain is highly integrated, is dependent on key nodes on different countries or different firms. So no one can make it alone. And even though the European Union and the US have a special economic, political relations, it's also important for the European Union to look beyond, to try to develop new synergies with other countries. And I think in this case, the dialogue that started with Japan, South Korea, India goes in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for critically exploring the toolbox of initiatives and measures by the EU in the field. There are many inputs from you. Thanks for this. I'll leave it to Sanne van der Loot, the role of discussant, and space for comments. Over to you, Sanne. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for these excellent presentations and papers. It's great to have a panel where we have two papers, both on transatlantic cooperation on semiconductors, and then both perspectives, because that makes us see clearer where the commonalities are and where the differences are. In this short time that I have, I'd like to give a very short summary of this overlap of the differences. Then I have a main question to the two authors, and then I would like to give a Dutch perspective on the matter as well. Like you said in the introduction, I have been working for the Dutch Parliament for 2 years, have been involved in these discussions on ASML, and actually, as a matter of fact, I have been dragging this discussion into the Dutch Parliament. So first, what the EU and the US share, what was in both papers, is this experience of this recent shortage of chips. So during the lockdowns, consumer patterns totally changed. Fewer cars were sold, and people just wanted laptops, computers, game consoles. And the car manufacturers made a mistake by ordering way less chips while all the new car models actually need many more chips than the former models because of all these new smart features. And when the demand for cars came up again, they were last in the very long line for chips because the chip manufacturers, they changed their focus to what was higher in demand. But since the car industry is so important for local employment and tax revenues, this hits economies on both sides of the Transatlantic quite hard. So this is a common experience. What both papers also mentioned is the vulnerabilities of the semiconductor sector, pointing to the concentration of certain key processes. As a matter of fact, the chip industry is actually very flexible, but there are indeed two main choke points. That is TSMC in Taiwan, ASML in the Netherlands, and they are very much connected because it was 1987 that TSMC dared to invest in this a bit crazy, very new Dutch company, ASML, and since that time they made each other huge. Every single company in the world that wants to mass produce high advanced chips needs TSMC, and in order to do this, TSMC needs ASML. But one thing that I want to make really clear is if you want to make very advanced chips, you don't need the most advanced technology. And therefore I need to get very quickly in a very simplified version into how are chips made. So it's 3 steps. The very first step is called deposition. It's putting a very thin film layer on a wafer. And the more precise you can put this thin layer on the wafer, the easier it is to make an advanced chip. There is one Dutch company, it's called ASMI, so not ASML. ASMI is able to make layers that are 1 atom thick, this thick. Then there is the second step, that is lithography. That is baking a very specific pattern on this film layer. That is what ASML is the expert on. Their machines are the most advanced in the world. They have a global monopoly on the highest advanced machines for this. It's EUV, and they have a 95% market share in the one generation older technology, DUV. So they are the market leader in this. And then you have a third step that is removing the redundant parts of this film layer. This is called etching. American companies are leading in the world for this technology. And then all these steps can be repeated endlessly until you build a very advanced chip. You don't need the most advanced technology for this, but if you have the most advanced technology, you can do this with hardly any repetition. So that will mean that you can mass produce highly advanced chips, and all the companies that sell devices with chips in them, they want to have those chips as quick as possible because they want to be the first with a new smart feature. So that is why companies are willing to buy the most advanced machines. And that brings me to the most important difference between the EU and US perspective that was addressed in both papers. And that is the unilateral American export restrictions for advanced chip technology. The authors, both authors, I believe, argued that the US is less willing to combat China because European companies are more depending on the Chinese economy than the US is. But could it actually also be that what the US believes is necessary to protect its own national security and its strategic autonomy is actually harming the strategic autonomy and therefore the national security of the EU? So that brings me to the main question for the authors. What is precisely the common goal for EU-US cooperation on semiconductors? Because I heard one rather selfish goal, which is to strengthen domestic industry, manufacturing. This to me sounds more like a basis for competition than cooperation. And then I heard another argument, national security, and that's one I don't buy. And here comes my Dutch perspective on this. When in 2018, the US government convinced the Dutch Prime Minister to no longer sell EUV to China, so the most advanced machines from ASML. At that time, US companies were still allowed to sell the most advanced etching technology to China. Then, October 2022, the US government announced their new export restrictions for advanced chip technology. Again, etching was not on the list until Dutch companies were complaining about this, and then etching became on the list. But still, it was not enough for the US government. They kept pushing the Dutch government for also stopping selling DUV machines to China. And the argument for this was that Chinese companies managed to get their hands on so-called booster technologies. So now they were able to, with older DUV technology, still make very advanced chips. Guess what these booster technologies are? Mostly American etching technology. So why does ASML have to pay the price? So finally, the Dutch government decided in June that indeed ASML is no longer allowed to sell the most advanced DUV machines. The pressure of the US was too high, and they even put their support to Ukraine on the negotiation table. What did the EU do? Of course, the point, it is right, it is a national mandate. It's about export control. But even if it was not a national mandate, the Netherlands did not get much support from the EU, because the biggest member states were most concerned about the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act to their car industry. So they were very willing to actually use ASML as a bargaining chip to save their car industry. They did not seem to realize, and I also actually did not really see it emphasized in the paper on the EU perspective, that ASML is the bargaining chip for the EU to acquire the technology, the chip technology that we don't have at the moment. And for the EU, for ASML to stay this strong bargaining chip, it needs to be ahead of its competition. In order to be ahead of its competition, it needs to invest in R&D. In order to invest in R&D, it needs to sell its cash cows. These are not the EUV machines. These are not the most advanced DUV machines. These are the machines that are a little bit less advanced than their most advanced DUV machines. Now comes the challenge. 4 months after the Dutch government decided in June that ASML could no longer sell their most advanced DUV machines, the US government overruled this and said that ASML is also no longer allowed to sell these little less advanced DUV machines, their cash cows. It's now actually, it's not a national mandate anymore, because we passed the Netherlands draw this line of export control in June, and now it is a trade issue. And we actually do have an instrument for this on EU level. It's called the anti-coercion instrument, because it is the main tech company of the Netherlands, and I could argue the main tech company of Europe that is now restricted in its exports by the US government. And I think that we in the EU should actually think about this if we are going to use this instrument, because otherwise it can actually set a very scary precedent for EU technology.
Thank you very much, San. Many inputs for us and the others, and the direct questions. We are running out of time, so I ask you to be brief in responding to some question, or if you want to add some information on your paper. Thanks.
Make a very quick response to the question of what the goal should be on cooperation. I think mutual dependence is probably the phrase that fits what the goal should be. You know, building up an autarkic industry on the other side is not possible. So I'm saying it's perhaps easier said than done, considering the actual reality on the ground, especially tensions over these export controls. But I think keeping the mutual dependence in mind, the longer term goal. And in the meantime, coordination can still happen on critical minerals, for example, or workforce, especially. I think those are areas of possible cooperation outside areas of greater synergy.
I think, like, I completely agree, first of all. In the paper, you find these kind of, let's say, critical questions, because I think sometimes, especially, you know, from a narrative perspective, it's very easy to say transatlantic cooperation. but in reality is about balance of power. And sometimes, like we have seen, especially with the export control, a more passive, let's say, action from the European Union side. But I also think that in terms of chips, what is the goal should be diversification, meaning, and that is my final remark that I did before. So basically, we need to get ready also for a potential Trump 2, maybe. Who knows, right? So you know that with the wild card of Trump, maybe, transatlantic relation could change. So I think for the European Union, it's very important to diversify its supplier, and it's important to develop new synergies with other countries. And of course, that doesn't mean that we need to ignore or mitigate the core transatlantic relations, but we need to be equal partner. That is the key message. And you become an equal partner if the European Union becomes a more union. So instead of talking about national interest, we should talk about European interest first.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for your valuable contribution, for all the inputs. We need to leave the stage to session 2, especially to Federica Marconi. I leave to you for moderating the next session. Thanks a lot.
We now move to the second session to discuss EU and US strategic and economic interest in digital infrastructure and in its development, with a particular focus on the initiatives aimed to increase security and resilience of digital infrastructure, especially in the face of disruptions and vulnerabilities that may have deep economic, security, and political implications, as well as challenges and opportunity to transatlantic cooperation. Since we are running out of time, I'll stop here and just give the floor to our speakers. But first, I'd like to introduce them. So, welcome to Nicolas Bouchou, who is going to join us as discussant for this panel, and he is a senior consultant and advisor to the Dean Asian Development Bank Institute. Then we have Anselm Küsters, head of the Department of Digitalization and New Technologies, and André Wolf, head of the Department of Technology, Infrastructure and Industrial Development, both from the Center for European Policy. And again, we have Giulia Treu. And I'd like actually to start from your paper, so from the US perspective. And the title of the paper is Transatlantic Tech Bridge, Digital Infrastructure and Subsea Cables, a US Perspective, written together with Megan Roberts, former Deputy Director Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative from the German Marshall Fund.
Thank you, Federica. I have to say, I was really happy to work on this paper and the subsea cables issue, because I grew up right next door to where the first France-US cable came ashore. My neighbor's house was called the Cable House. So this is really an interest from day one. But digital infrastructure more broadly it's really where the physical and digital worlds collide, and everything that we think of as being rather abstract in the cloud, no, they're very dependent on these terrestrial systems. And over 99% of internet traffic goes across the more or less 400 subsea cables. Precise calculations are difficult without knowing precise data on satellite traffic, but the vast majority of these internet cables were laid in the post-Cold War period, and they sort of illustrate the globalization since the first fiber optic cable was laid in 1988. And new cable investments reached 2.2 billion from 2016 to 18, but forecasts are that new investments will exceed 10 billion by 2024. So these cables are becoming more and more important. State-backed companies were managing the process initially before being taken over by telecom firms, but now the 4 hyperscalers, as they called, which are Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft, are involved in almost every new cable being laid. And they work with the 4 major cable firms, which are Subcom from the US, NEC Corporation, which is Japanese, Alcatel Submarine, which is French, and HMNTech, which is Chinese. And I would point out that the supply chain for the raw materials that make up the cables is not dependent on China, as it is in chips, for example, and other digital topics that we might talk about. So in terms of US policy, the phrase that you see everywhere in US documents is that the overarching strategic goal is an open, secure, interoperable global internet. And this means, in practice, one where US digital leaders can compete and one that can win. And their concerns about digital infrastructure are overlapping, including physical security, fears of espionage, economic competitiveness, and support for domestic firms, and then geopolitical fears and fears about technology leakage. So these manifest in several domestic and international priorities. I talked about Bidenomics on the CHIPS panel, and the infrastructure bill allocates $65 billion for high-speed internet deployment domestically. So building out US domestic digital infrastructure is a real priority of these policies under President Biden. But again, the outcompeting China and the subsea Cold War is a big, big piece of the approach to digital infrastructure in the US. The fear is that Chinese infrastructure investments through the digital Silk Road will lead to control and facilitate espionage. The national security strategy talks about China as a source of untrusted infrastructure, and sanctions have been levied against HMNTech, which was Huawei Marine until 2019. And they had built up about 15% of the global market by that point when sanctions were levied against them. An important focus for the US is also the rip and replace process for Huawei-built infrastructure domestically. And this is where the US is putting pressure on Europe as well, and expressing concerns about reliance on 5G infrastructure built by Huawei. Under President Trump, they also built up a team called Team Telecom, which is, among other responsibilities, ensuring that no subsea cable would directly connect the US with the Chinese mainland. And the US Congress has also passed or been active on several bills regarding undersea cables. The US also, in order to ensure the market dominance by its firms or by US firms, intervenes in cases of Chinese involvement in infrastructure projects. And the pressure has led to some canceled cable initiatives or contracts. The numbers sort of show how this pressure has played out in recent years. From 2016 to 2020, over 75% of new cables had at least one Chinese owner. And projections for the 2021-2025 period are 0. So the US has really pushed on getting Chinese suppliers out of new cables. In terms of global cooperation, this takes place through bodies like the ITU at the UN, through the International Cable Protection Committee, which is a multi-stakeholder body. The US has not ratified the UN Law of the Seas, so even though that provides a legal framework for digital infrastructure, the US has not ratified it and probably will not anytime soon. NATO has also built up a coordination cell, and the US has a variety of different partnerships on digital infrastructure, usually through regional associations like the Quad, or through the Clean Network Initiative, which is built up by the State Department, which isn't particularly active at the moment. I thought I would highlight a few challenges as well. The first of which is that attribution is not always particularly straightforward. A lot of the information is not publicly available on that. And so even though most cable faults, and there's about 100 per year, can be attributed to accidental errors, so fishing boats or geologic incidents, it is not sharks, which is a misconception, which do not bite the cables. The risk and the fear of state-directed cyber attacks is rising, but a lot of the examples remain hypothetical or classified. Landing stations in particular are where the most likely vulnerabilities are. That's where the cable comes ashore and where security lacks security could allow for monitoring or tapping. An additional potential challenge is that cable owners have engaged in different cost reduction measures, which have led to deployment of remote management systems, and since those systems are internet connected, that represents a new source of vulnerability. De-risking or decoupling from China is also easier said than done. Internet traffic travels on these cables between the US and China regardless. And as this sector is almost all private, these are commercial investments, information sharing with public entities is not always something that these firms are very willing to do. In terms of EU-US cooperation, the evaluations of the relative threat are not always the same as well, even though most of the cables coming into Europe are not Chinese owned. If you take the example of the peace cable that goes into Marseille and then through Kenya to Pakistan that is built by a Chinese supplier, the US was not super happy about it. But overall, there are shared goals between the US and EU on digital infrastructure, resiliency, and building up connectivity as well. So in the paper, I talked about a few possible recommendations. The first being digital diplomacy, so partnerships with third countries. And so this as a development goal has to it, which is increasing connectivity in the global south. And sometimes it's a response to a security concern as well. Boosting information sharing, deepening investment in bodies like the ITU and multi-stakeholder bodies, which can help with the information sharing. Closing framework loopholes in the legal frameworks, cooperating on understanding the physical threats, whether they be seismic activity or other natural disasters. And I think in the context of increasing climate disruption, this is an important area. And finally, looking forward and cooperating on joint research and initiatives, especially on post-quantum cryptography for cables, or eventually for initiatives like power over fiber. So there are areas for increased cooperation, even though the US and EU, as usual, do not completely see eye to eye on digital infrastructure.
Many thanks, Julia, for this very comprehensive overview, and especially for focusing on submarine and communication cable, given their importance for the connectivity system. I now move to the other side of the table, and I give the floor to you for the presentation of the paper Challenges to Transatlantic Digital Infrastructure and EU Perspective, jointly written together with Eleonora Poli, Head of Analysis at the Center for European Policy. So please.
Yeah, Julia already mentioned, I think regarding the goals, yes, have a lot of problems. Regarding the goals, I think there's not much discrepancy between the US and the EU. Both are in principle in favor for an open and secure internet, even though the stakes are, of course, economically a bit different regarding the market shares. That's something I think that departs the two regions. But nevertheless, the goals in general are similar. However, you could say that at least for some time, the EU has been a bit negligent regarding the dangers and the threats imposed by an open international and global internet. However, in recent years, I think you can see some serious signs that awareness has increased. For instance, when you have a look at recent strategies in 2020, the EU released a new security compass, where it basically highlighted major areas also of military threats. And they also made very clear that cybersecurity, security of critical digital infrastructure is one critical building block in this. And not in the sense just of digital infrastructure in its narrow sense. So not just talking about deep sea cables, but also talking about digital threats, for instance, to the functioning of the electricity transmission system, electricity cables, and gas pipelines. So it's quite, I think, a wide approach that is taken here. At the same time, in its security compass, the EU is strengthening and making sure that there is more diplomacy going on in this respect. So it tries to coordinate a joint diplomatic response of EU countries to potential malicious foreign cyber activities. It is also trying to strengthen the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure in general, for instance, by its economic security strategy released last year, which is, I think, for the first time, an event where the EU recognized the similarity and deep interconnectedness between physical military security on the one hand and economic security issues on the one hand. So the basic fact that we cannot think of supply chain securities and military securities as two independent questions, but rather as something that has to be discussed jointly, that has to be tackled also in a way that is consistent with regard to its overall economic security goals. Strategies were not the only response so far. Within its wide, narrow competencies in some fields, there were also some actions taken by the EU in technical terms. It has launched, for instance, a 5G toolbox, which tries to protect the 5G network in the EU by some preemptive measures. On the one hand, in technical terms, so trying to make sure that all the precautions are taken in order to avoid that foreign attacks can be placed on 5G networks, but also from an economic perspective, by means of market-related preemptive measures, trying to detect whether there is a risk that some sort of market concentration could evolve in some part of the supply chain, and thereby also an increased foreign dependence could be observed. There's also been a Network and Information Security Directive, which tries to strengthen cooperation, information exchange regarding cyber threats, regarding network security, also to sort of balance information discrepancies between member states, to detect potential weak spots in the framework of member states, and thereby ensure that security of the EU as a whole is increasing. And there's also been, at the level of products, been a Cyber Resilience Act, which imposes specific requirements, security requirements on the producers of hardware and software. So based on this, I think you can see that the EU is increasingly taking also something like a supply chain perspective on the security and the resilience of the critical infrastructure. There have also been some concrete initiatives, both by the EU and the member states. I just mentioned a few here. For instance, there's been the initiative called Gaia-X, I think initially launched by Germany and France, which tries to set up something like a common European cloud infrastructure, not in the form of a centralized system, but in the form of a way of linking decentral cloud providers in order to create something like European cloud infrastructure. There have also been recent attempts to finance and to support the installation of new submarine cables by the EU and member states. For instance, through its infrastructure investment vehicle, Connecting Europe facility, the EU has provided, or will provide also in the future, hundreds of millions of euros to submarine cable projects by member states. This Monday, it has also released a new recommendation to member states, urging them to invest into submarine cables on their own, also in situations where this might involve further state aid. So it's also potentially a way to exercise some exemptions on state aid restriction rules to establish something like, a common member states-driven European submarine infrastructure. And right recently, there's been an attempt to launch an own European satellite constellation called IRIS², which tries to provide both civil and military services, and is about to be launched already this year in 2024. However, despite all these unilateral attempts, there are, of course, limitations to the capacity of the EU to act on its own due to the high technological complexity, due to the strong interconnectedness, especially with relation to the dominance of oceanic submarine cables already mentioned by Julia. So therefore, also by the EU, attempts have been made to support and to increase US-EU cooperation in this field, further pointed out by
Yeah, thank you very much. I will contribute now with a couple of sentences on this topic of EU-US cooperation, and I thought it's probably best to start with a concrete example to go a bit beyond the nice slogans of EU strategy documents. So one concrete project that is currently being planned and being laid out is the so-called CME-6 cable. That's hugely important. It's 19,200 kilometers long, and when being completed, it will run from Singapore via the Indian Ocean and the Suez Canal directly to the Mediterranean Sea. And this cable is quite interesting from our perspective on geopolitics and the technology race for two reasons. First, initially, much of this cable was being planned by China's biggest operators, China Telecom and China Mobile. But because of the current geopolitical turn, they have been pushed out. And now this project is being managed by a US company, Subcom. And the second reason is that this cable, when it will be finished, is a crucial alternative to the peace cable that Julia already mentioned, which is currently connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe. So in our assessment, this is a nice example of this kind of duplication efforts that the EU and the US are currently pushing to diversify that might not make sense from a purely economic point of view, but because they also incorporate some strategic thinking. And going beyond this one concrete example, many of these projects are currently planned in the context of the TTC, which we have already heard about at the beginning. So right at the beginning of the first TTC meeting in Pittsburgh, there was this idea that the US and the EU should try to find joint financing for internet projects in developing countries. And quite quickly, it turned out that many of these projects could be related to sea cables. So at a TTC meeting in December 22, the EU and the US announced several projects, especially in Jamaica and Kenya, related to sea cables. And then in mid-2023, they proceeded with further announcements in Costa Rica and Philippines. So in our assessment, this TTC working group could be a good avenue to further EU-US cooperation with respect to sea cables. And maybe a final point I want to make in this part of our presentation is that there's also growing empirical evidence in the literature that looks at the effects of these common cable projects. And what they show is in a sense that the current EU approach that looks only at market failures and has a very specific economic perspective is maybe not portraying the full picture. Often you have a lot of spillovers in a macroeconomic sense. So in developing countries that participate in these cable projects, there's an increase in the quantity and quality of jobs in these areas. They also have a positive impact on financial services because they benefit from the increased digital infrastructure. And of course, there are the positive effects on the strategic autonomy perspective. So overall, this literature suggests that the EU should go beyond its current focus on state aid and identifying market failures, but also look at these macroeconomic spillovers and strategic reasons for pushing EU-US cooperation. And from this broader perspective, we will now formulate a couple of our recommendations, and I hand back to Andrew.
Yes, thanks a lot. You mentioned cooperation in terms of also strategy to implement developmental goals, to create macroeconomic growth potentially in developing economies. As you correctly pointed out, I think that's one very important channel also to convince third countries, not just the US, to cooperate with the EU. And if we discuss these questions, of course, we always need to mention the big elephant in the room, and that's the Chinese digital Silk Road, also already mentioned. We think that in order to be successful for the EU in gaining new partners in these areas, we need to indicate that we differ from China in the strategy. That we follow a less interventionist logic, also when it comes to domestic strategic decisions of these countries, that we really try to offer them a cooperation at eye-to-eye level. What does this mean? Well, we think it could take several forms in principle. It could involve a cooperation and the common development of technical standards for their improvement. Also to provide these countries with some information advantage. It could involve support the development of an own digital governance strategies in these countries. The EU could also support them increasing their digital resilience. So all these unilateral measures the EU is currently trying to launch to implement could also be tried to transfer to potential third partner countries in order to increase the attractiveness of the EU. And we also think it's very important to offer them something like a real sustainable growth perspective. So not giving them the impression that they will be the raw material supply of the EU in the next 30 to 40 years. I think in order to be convincing as a potential partner, the EU needs to indicate that it has the willingness also to cooperate in terms of value chain upgrading, to offering them the perspective to increase their share in knowledge-intensive manufacturing and the export of knowledge-intensive goods, also located further downstream in the supply chains that will be important, will be essential in a green and digitalized future. So therefore, also from this perspective, we think it's important not just to limit the considerations of cooperation just to the digital area or just to infrastructure. Also, when talking about US and US-EU cooperation, it is very important also to link it to existing initiatives in related areas. For instance, the Raw Materials Club, currently in the process of being implemented, increased cooperation negotiations about tariffs on green products like green steel. We think it's a good idea actually to link all this under a common header, under a common umbrella. On the one hand, of course, to create scale economies in negotiations, reducing transaction costs, but on the other hand, also to consider the basic fact that all these initiatives and goals are linked, and they are linked in the end by the common strategic goal to realize the supply chains of the future, to realize them in the manner that both strengthens and maintains strategic autonomy of the EU and also of the US, while at the same time also, of course, maintaining the competitiveness and the jobs of European and US industries. So therefore, I think it is important to give the clear message that it's not limited just to digital infrastructure. We think we need to think more broadly in that sense, to see it as a part of a unified and broad common US-EU strategy trying to build the economy of the future.
And to close our recommendation list, I will add 3 more points and be quick given the time. So first, we see more potential for collaboration and research for developing more resilient data transmitting cables. In particular, this has a physical protection dimension. So developing, for instance, specific types of concrete that could be put on very sensitive parts of these pipelines, but also certain surveillance measures. So for instance, there's research in kind of certain sensors or certain fiber optic cables that could sense if something is being dropped nearby. Secondly, we think we should also find forms of increased protection of the key cable routes, particularly in the Baltic Sea. For this, it's important to collaborate with the NATO framework, which has a special group dealing with subsea cables. And of course, it's impossible to protect the whole 1.4 million kilometers of submarine cables worldwide. But we know that there are specific points where they are very vulnerable, often close to the shore, when they arrive at the landing sites, because this is when Russia can hit them with anchors accidentally. So we think increasing here as surveillance capabilities, but also specialized boats, as the UK has them, or drones, could be important as a deterrence factor. And then finally, to unite all of these different points, we think it's also important for the EU to have a joint EU commissioner for security and defense that could incorporate many of these ideas, that could be speaking with one voice for the EU and help to define a common geographic vision together with the US. Thank you.
Many thanks for all the inputs you provided, especially with these final recommendations. So I now move to Nicolas for the discussion.
Thank you very much. I might echo the discussion, but with a little bit of a different perspective. As a very much convinced European, right, born in Strasbourg, so I mean I'm a convinced European, and I'm looking also at what is happening in Europe at the moment from Japan, as being part of the Asian Development Bank Institute, having collaborated with that institute in the last 6 years and joined it more formally in the last 2 years, especially last year when Japan was chairing the G7. And as I came back from another mission from Tokyo last week, and just a few minutes after I landed, I was like, I could see an overflow of information about the war with Ukraine, about Russia, about things that were not related to our discussion here, but about farmers protesting, etc. I thought, what a different world, right? What a different world. And then, yes, 80 years ago, there was the preparation of the D-Day, and 80 years ago, there was the Bretton Woods Conference, etc. So it seems so natural for us, and the EU was also very much profiting by US support. However, I could not help but noticing that when you mentioned about a number of, say, initiatives linked with the cables, for example, undersea cables, that the US did not sign up for the Law of the Seas agreement. And we must take great care about who is managing how and in which regard multilateral relationships and the relation with the UN. I think this is a very important issue for Europe to look at how it can continue have a strong multilateral approach by continuing to build with the US, but also all the issues that were discussed today, the ones in this panel and the previous one about the chips and semiconductors. It's impossible to have this discussion without considering how the world is developing outside of the EU, US, and even somehow China is more complicated than that. I was thinking if there had been an Indian colleague in the room, he was, what about India, right? You're talking about EU and the US and China, but what about India? And India is supposed to be the next G2 economy, you know, etc. So maybe I'm still influenced by how great India is doing, and because during the last year, during the G20 India, there was really a very, very strong G20 India in all regards, including in terms of external communication. But if you look at the G20 India final declaration, which was endorsed both by EU, by Italy, by the US and other countries, about a third of the final declaration is about digital transformation and technological changes, but in a way that is significantly different from the, I would say, overall rather defensive approach I've been hearing about throughout the whole afternoon. And the more it goes, the more it seems that there is ourselves and the outside world, including China. And if you look back at how the EU was dealing with such approaches, maybe some would put as very naive, maybe just 15 or 20 years ago. We need to be aware, at least, of how much there is an ongoing series of transformations and changes. Then I was also thinking about the same sets of issues about digital transformation, etc., in the context of the G7 Japan, right? If you look back at the declaration of the G20 leaders in Hiroshima, you would find some quotes, yes, about digital health or digital and green transformation, but the bulk of it is how to manage AI, how to manage interoperability of action plans within the spheres of the G7, whereas in the context of the G20, it's much more about development. And if you consider now that the African Union has become a new member of the G20 and Africa is bound to double in size of population in the next 20 years, it cannot be just about holding up to defensive positions about now, but there is clearly also an underlying competition, and the EU must be, I would say, very much aware of that. It was mentioned also several times that there is a very fierce competition with our US friends and US companies, right? Also to get future prime access to such future huge markets. So in this regard, I would say, of course, yes, the digital transatlantic bridge for economic security and cooperation, which is the core of the machine. But if it is not balanced by other ways, especially for the EU to look at EU-India and EU-China still, but EU-Africa in the context of how things are changing, it will not just be about this technological optimum or this way to protect undersea cables, etc. I don't want to be too provocative, but yes, the protection of undersea cables, but if you look just at the New York Times, who has sabotaged Nord Stream 2, right? There's a big question here. So we must be very much aware of this changing context that is about changing multipolar orders. Then I was also very much surprised when discussing about such transformations about Japan itself. And in our discussions with the current dean of ADBI, he always complains about, in his own terms, he's Japanese, right? About how Japan has become lazy and how about Japanese companies have lost competitiveness and so on and so on and so on. And it's true. I remember an article from CSIS from just last year, right? Who was saying that at the end of the 80s, Japan was holding more than 50% of the world industry of semiconductors, whereas now it is generally considered, even from Japan, that Japan is lagging 10 years behind, right? So I think that there are two underlying questions in the discussion of today. One is somehow how to navigate in a very pragmatic way in the short term, right? That is next 6 months, next year and a half, and so on. And then the other approach should be also how to navigate in the next 15, 20 years, according to sort of a longer, of a wider approach to long-term innovation cycles and how to grab them, I would say a little bit independently from the fierce geopolitical competition that is taking place now. The last two remarks, if you allow me, were about also thinking about now the G7 Italy, then back in 21, the G20 Italy, and somehow some aspects of the legacy of the G20 Italy. It's interesting to note that be it in the G7 or in the G20, major US think tanks are a little bit absent. They are not so much interested in joining those multilateral arenas. And this was the case last year. We struggled hard, despite it was Japan, right, to get a couple of US counterparts. But I don't see this year that they are super excited to join the T7. And likely in the context of the T20 Brazil is a bit different because Brazil is very close to the US, but last year during the G20 India is not so much the case. So there might be also here an opportunity to revive a little bit more, I would say, open discussion, with open air discussion with our US counterparts to think about future development models. And last but not least, after the G20 Italy and with Compagnia di San Paolo, we thought about how to continue part of the discussions about future infrastructure systems. We were frustrated, including with then President of Compagnia, Francesco Profumo, who was co-chairing the infrastructure task force, that we could not touch upon such discussions as we have today, or very little, and that also space and spatial aspects or competition were also a bit lacking, and how to continue on that. So the year after, when was it? The year after, yes, during the G20 Indonesia, we initiated a format of dialogues called the Cavour Dialogues. It's very informal, but we met in Torino at the Circolo del Littori, and there was a portrait of Cavour. We made a photo and we thought, oh, let's organize the Cavour meetings. So, and then there was only one such meeting, but there might be an opportunity to relaunch that format. especially because also in ADBI, with the former dean, who was the chair of the T20 Japan back in 2019, we had a project of a kind of a handbook on the sustainable and future infrastructure investment systems, right? About a mix of what we are discussing about today and the more traditional way to think about sustainable infrastructure investments. We move forward. We have a publisher, which is Elgar Publishing in the UK, which has confirmed. Then this project disappeared, but in the past days it emerged again. It's confirmed, and it should be done by 2025. I was discussing with a few colleagues here in the room. So even when things look a little bit bleak, there is hope to do better together. So maybe the Cavro meetings, maybe this handbook, these are as many opportunities to really, I would say, continue to think ahead while being very much aware of the challenges of the time. So thank you very much.
Many thanks. So I'd like to give the panelists the opportunity to very quickly react to this and to share your final thoughts.
Thank you to IAI for putting together these two panels today. Thank you all for listening to me as I sat here the whole time. I think in going over the recommendations that we had, we showed that perhaps in this area of digital infrastructure, the areas for cooperation are a little more apparent than perhaps in the chips sector. I think the goals are largely the same, and I think it's important to also keep this shorter versus longer term perspective. And I'm glad that you brought that up and sort of pull out the perhaps old thinking that's keeping us in this EU-US tunnel vision when the rest of the world is not thinking about that as well. I also would love to talk to you later about your comment on the US think tanks not interested in joining these dialogues. I will call up my colleagues in Washington and see what they have to say about that. But otherwise, no, I think those are my final reactions.
Yeah, thank you for the great comments. I completely agree that this whole setup of the EU is very defensive in its approach. The whole idea of building up resilience implies there will be shocks, there will be crises, and it's not in our power anymore to influence them to a significant degree, to prevent them even. We just have to make sure we somehow survive them and can bounce back. So that's per se defensive. And I also agree that you have to look at the very changed context. A good example is the US Clean Cable initiative that was mentioned earlier. When it was announced, I think in 2020, EU member states basically agreed, but there was not a lot of practical effects coming from this. And this was because they didn't like Trump and because they were very naive when it came to Huawei. And basically, Germany said we consider this not a big risk. And today, this has completely changed in just a couple of years. So you could relaunch this initiative, and I think it would have very different effects. And maybe the final point about India, I think it's a very good example of the kind of regions you have to consider beyond EU-US cooperation. And if I'm not mistaken, there's also a TTC with India. So one intuitive way would be to include in this TTC also discussions about digital infrastructure projects such as sea cables. And this maybe points to what André mentioned earlier, that you have to combine this resilience approach with a development perspective that is attractive for these regions, because you cannot expect that they pay for our strategic interests, but because they want to develop themselves. So you have to combine that. And the TTC with India would be a good example for that.
Yeah, just strictly from my side, also thanks a lot for adding the perspective of other major global economies. I think that's very essential, because in the end, we're still talking about something like a global open infrastructure. And if we want to maintain this infrastructure in a way that fits our values, our common values, I think we need to sort of restrict the influence of actors that are hostile to this idea. And for this, we need all the allies we can get If you want to have them as allies, we need to respect also their economic interests, their potential contributions to something like resilient digital and non-digital supply chains. And therefore, I think it's very important not to see this as something like a transatlantic project or initiative, but something that has to cross the whole globe. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So we actually ran out of time, and the president of Istituto Affari Internazionali, Ambassador Ferdinando Nelli Feroci, had to leave earlier. So, and he apologizes for this. To conclude, I just want to thank you all for being here. And I want to let you know that the paper that have just been presented are available online, and that there will be a further event in Turin focusing on the energy field and on the case study of hydrogen. So hope to see you there. Thank you.